Welcome to the Dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at running city campaigns as a dungeon master. Now, I did a video not too long ago about great NPCs, and I think that city campaigns are a perfect place for this kind of thing because you're going to have a lot of recurring NPCs. If the players are stationed in one area, they're going to keep going back to those same people and re-interacting with them over and over again. So I really like city campaigns. I've run quite a few of them in different types of game systems as well. I'm mostly going to talk about a couple of the ones I've run recently. One was in a Shadowrun campaign where the players were based out of Warsaw, Poland. And mostly I'm going to talk about my Whitespire campaign in D&D, where the campaign was named after the city of Whitespire, which is where the players were from, and that's where they're based from. And some of them had been born and raised there their entire lives, right? Some of them were more new. So I need to be clear about some things right off the bat, though. A city campaign can be very, very rewarding, in my opinion at least. There's a lot more variety and intrigue. You can have a lot of political type stuff in it, and I think that there's just so much potential for these type of games, which is one reason I love them so much. But as a dungeon master, you need to be aware that they are a lot of work, especially compared to a dungeon crawl. And I'm not trying to look down on dungeon crawls. I absolutely love dungeon crawls. I started with D&D basic set, Keep on the Borderlands, and the Caves of Chaos. That's where I started, and I love dungeon crawls. I'm not trying to downplay them. I'm not one of these guys who looks down on them and thinks if all you do is dungeon crawls and your game isn't good or whatever. But I like to have variety, and one thing I love about a city campaign is that you can kind of do it all. You can do city stuff, you can still go to dungeons, you can be hired to go clear out, some temple in the swamps by some noble family who's like, hey, this family heirloom was lost and we think it's in this crypt. We want you to bring it back for us, but anything else you get is yours. And the players might be like, yeah, sure, that sounds pretty good, right? You could have, a lot of maybe some church comes to the players and says, hey, somebody's animating all the dead in this crypt and defiling this crypt, and we've tried, but we can't really deal with it. We need you to investigate. And the players can find it out, defeat the undead, find the necromancer or evil guy who's doing it, and put an end to it. So you can run dungeons in the city. And if you look at the world of Greyhawk, that was originally just a city in the background with a bunch of dungeons. And the city just really existed as a place for the players to have a place to sleep and store their stuff and resupply. But as time went on, the city grew and became an entire world, became an entire game world. And that's one thing I think is very encouraging. You don't need to know every detail of your city or of your game world when the game starts. I am a big fan of having just a lot of notes, but sparse notes. So I'm going to talk a lot in this video about some other game systems and stuff, because I steal stuff from other people all the time. One of my favorite inspirations of the Whitespire city was a Frog God Games product called The Blight by, I think it's Richard Pett, I think his name is. And he did a bunch of stuff with Pathfinder as well. Apparently I never played Pathfinder, but he's considered to be quite excellent. And I can see why, because The Blight was phenomenal. And it was just dirty and grungy, this just filthy city with just nothing but despair and loss, where everybody was corrupt and decadent and evil. And I really loved a lot of that. But I didn't want my city to be that dark. I wanted it to have a lot of those elements, but I wanted it to be a place with hope and joy still too. And I didn't want everything to just be all evil all the time. I also wanted it to be my city. I didn't want to just take somebody else's city. And there's nothing wrong with that either. I'll talk about Waterdeep in a minute with Dragon Heist, and how I think that Dragon Heist would make a great start mission for an entire Waterdeep campaign. And sure, you could just do Dragon Heist and then run Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Nothing wrong with that. But I also think Dragon Heist would be a great starter introductory mission to get the players established, give them a place of operation, and then run a great city campaign from there. And if you don't want to make your own city, that's a great way to do it. So I'll talk about that. I'll also talk about a bunch of the online resources you can use. And I mean, Wizards of the Coast has some good stuff. Dungeon Master's Guide has some nice stuff that's pretty handy, random tables and stuff. But if you really want to have a good city game, like just go online, start Googling some of this stuff, and you can just find like there's tons of free resources that you can just print off. And I do that kind of stuff all the time. I also think one of the important things about a city is making that city seem like a real place and giving it this kind of like texture that you don't necessarily need when you're just visiting some random town on your travels and the players don't care about it. So one of the most important things I did was I made a list of all the different districts of Whitespire. So I have the capital, which is colloquially known as Hightown. I've got Booktown. I've got the Festival Grounds, Lowtown, which actually consists of the slums, the docks, and the artists' quarters. So Lowtown's almost 3 districts in one. And then I have the Hollow Hills, which I took great inspiration from the Blight. Basically, it's just this area that was like overmined, and because they're like right on the coast, it kind of, part of it collapsed. And now, so it used to be this great area, but now parts of it are not so good. Now his was like right in the city, he called it Sinks, but whatever, not really important. One of the things I loved about the Blight as well, which I am definitely going to do in any city campaign I ever do from now on, is he added a bunch of notes about how every quarter feels and how it like smells and stuff, not just looks. So I'll give you a quick example here with Lowtown, right? These are my notes on Lowtown, which are probably inspired by his, but a lot of them are my own ideas too, right? It says Lowtown feels crushed. Some have compared it to an anthill. Fires are common, and much effort is put into keeping them from engulfing the entire city. But it's also a very welcoming place where children play tag in the streets and run through the filth and don't really care, and they're just smiling and happy. It smells of dirt, sweat, and even human waste. And in the summer, many wear masks to compensate, or will wear like perfumes and oil in order to help drown out the smells. It feels hot, clammy, and gritty. It's also a difficult place to navigate. And then I also have a few places, right? So I talked about like the docks area, right? And I talked about like one of the big chapels in the area where the one player was connected because he was an orphan who'd grown up on the streets of Lowtown, and now he was a wizard at the Wizards Guild. So he'd kind of like come from nowhere, and now he was trying to establish himself. But he still had all these roots there, and he'd been a street urchin. And so I knew that like the place that had taken him in, this like orphanage run by some lawful good temple, had I wanted them to have a place, and if he ever wanted to go visit them, which he didn't, but that's okay, they would have a place there. So for every district, I wanted to have a look and feel to make that district feel unique and different, right? Like Booktown, I talk about how it's tall. It's not that it's a big district. It's just they ran out of room, so they just kept building up. And there's like causeways and like artificial bridges that just link different buildings from like the 4th floor on this building to the 5th floor of that one, and then the 4th floor of another one. And it's like a spider web almost, right? And it just gives each district a different feel and helps the city to just kind of come alive a little bit more. And I really like those kind of aspects. I really think too, this is why I mentioned online resources, random charts and tables, and then just write down. Definitely write it down. Do not trust yourself to remember, but like randomly write, or random tables plus writing things down is just an absolute lifesaver in this case. So I got this table from the Vornheim Complete City Kit, but honestly there's like a million out there. I'm not saying this one's better than the others or anything like that, but all it is taverns and games, and he just has 3 lists with d20s next to them all, right? So he has a first name, a last name, and a game. So you'd roll your 2d20, and you might have like the Bleak Queen or the Fond Cousin. I don't know. That place sounds a little creepy, actually. You might have the Shrieking Wench, or I was about to say the Frigid Beaver, which could be interpreted quite badly. In fact, beaver shouldn't be on your list. Just take beaver off the list. The Howling Beaver, the Busy Beaver, none of them, okay? None of them. You could have the Bell and Adler, the Knife and Beetle, whatever, right? Just random tables, roll it up, that's your tavern name. And then it just has drinking games. And I personally don't like to necessarily randomize my drinking games. I like the idea that different districts have kind of like their own thing. So one district, they might have like bare knuckle boxing, for example. They might have knife fights even. They might have arm wrestling. You know, another district might have darts. I could see some taverns wanting something a little more sophisticated. One of my favorites was the idea, I had this one tavern in Hightown, which the players never went to, unfortunately. But it was like a very upper class place, and a lot of nobles went there. And they had this giant gallery overlooking a massive chessboard. And their game was human chess. And a lot of the noble women would dress up and look as pretty as they could, because it was considered a great honor if one of the noble lords playing chess chose you to be the queen for their army. And, you know, they'd have like different like coats that they'd put on to show, you know, this is the black queen or the white queen or the black bishop or the white pawn or whatever. And then everybody would like look down from above, and it was always like very distinguished, noble crowd. And there'd be some betting, but it was like restrained and polite betting, because they're not, you know, they're not commoners just shouting stuff out. You know, that's for the peasants in Dockdown, you know. But I just liked the idea that different districts would have different games. Now, one of our favorites, which I did steal from Vornheim, or at least I stole the idea from it, and I expanded on greatly, was the idea they had like a Wheel of Fortune type game where they'd spin the wheel and it would give you an item and you'd have to get that item. So I just decided to take that to a whole another level, and I just have all these items, and I built a drinking game around it, and the players have to like run into the city and try to acquire these items without purchasing them. And so the players played the drinking game and they loved it. And then later they went back there to play it again, and then a different time they went back, and as they're coming into the bar, one of the players gets attacked by a dwarf who like knocks him over and then starts trying to steal his boot. He's like, I need your boots, man. And the player, knowing that this is for the drinking game, is just like, oh, he needs somebody's boots. He needs a stranger's boots. Okay. He's like, oh, I tell you what, you can just take them off my feet and just give them to me when you're done, okay? Like, you don't need to assault me. But it was nice because I didn't have to explain it. At this point, the players knew what was going on. So as soon as it happened, they're just like, oh, yes, this guy's playing the Demon Wheel game. And it was just a lot of fun. I like those kind of elements. It gave us a lot of room for role play and just some fun stuff. And it helped everything to feel like different and unique everywhere. So I want to give you some hints and some clues about how to make your life easier. I have like tons of detailed notes. I mean, you can see the size of this binder. It's not small. Now, to be fair, the back part of it is all dungeons. Actually, a little even more. So, you know, that's not part of the city, right? And there's also at the front, there's a bunch of stuff on the general world beyond the city. So it's really like the middle third, this is the city. But that's still a lot of notes, and that can be very intimidating as a dungeon master. But just know, I didn't have all those notes ready and good to go when the game started. A lot of them got added on as we went. And a lot of them, you know, like I might have, this is something I do a lot. So I have a section on like different thieves type elements, right? So I'll have a thieves guild, I might have a second thieves guild. I always want there to be more than one type of thing, so there's always going to be conflict. And then if the players want to get involved, there's different factions, and they have to like navigate that maze, right? So I might have like a thieves guild and an assassins guild, and maybe they're kind of rivals because, you know, lately maybe the assassins have been moving into the thief territory, or vice versa, and now the guilds are like, hey man, you're kind of walking on our territory here, you know? Or you have different thieves guilds that, you know, like maybe one's in Lowtown, and one's in, or, you know, part like the slums, and another one's in the docks. But the one in the docks is like, you know, we want to expand our territory, and that means we're going to have to go up against those guys. And these types of conflicts automatically add this extra level of intrigue to the game that I really like. And it adds that extra level of complexity, but not complexity in a bad way. Like Game of Thrones is a great example of one of my favorite TV shows ever. I mean, we'll ignore the last few seasons. We'll stick. Oh, I was going to say we'll stick to the books, but those aren't done yet either. So we'll stick to the good seasons, right? But they were ones where it had a lot of noble houses, and there's a lot of complexity there. And your game doesn't have to be that complex, but it could be. I mean, I'm not saying it can't be, right? But even if you just take some general ideas, like the Lannisters are rich, the Starks are honorable, and you just start with these general archetypes, and then you start figuring out who are the exceptions to the rule, or who is like Tyrion Lannister and Cersei Lannister are very different people, but they're both Lannisters, and they're both rich, and they're brother and sister, but it doesn't matter, right? Because Tyrion has his way of doing things, and Cersei has hers, right? And so you can start adding these extra layers of complexity in if the players are interested. But you don't want to go all like designing all these noble houses like Game of Thrones style, and then the players don't care about the noble houses at all, and they just ignore it. And it's a lot of work that really just didn't pay off. So I might have just some basic notes. I might have, okay, here's the Lannisters, for example, and they're really rich, and they want more power, but they don't have it, So who's the leader? Some guy named Tywin, and he's the leader. And then, later, if they start getting interested in the politics, I'll be like, okay, what's Tywin like? What's his family like? Okay, well, one of his wife's dead, and he's got these 3 children, and 2 of them are twins. So those 2 are like really close. It turns out they're really close. But then he's got this other one, and I don't know, maybe I'll say he's like a dwarf or something like that, and you start figuring out these extra layers of complexity if the players are interested. If the players don't care about the noble houses, you don't want to have 100 pages on noble houses. That's just a good way to frustrate yourself and to do a lot of unnecessary work. So like I said, I'll have brief notes and outlines. This is this noble house. This is this noble house. This is this noble house. Try to keep it to a page, maybe 2 sides of like double sheeted if you have to. But honestly, less is probably better in a game like this. And then if it becomes relevant, then you start to flush them out more. So I do that kind of stuff all the time. I had notes in my world, there was a Pantheon of Gods, and there was one god of every alignment, right? So there's a lawful good god, a lawful neutral, an lawful evil, etc., all the way through. And that was the Pantheon of Gods. And then that Pantheon had a group, kind of the worst kept secret in the world. It was just called the Inquisition. But it was just like all these clerics and paladins who basically worked together to maintain the dominance of that pantheon, because it turns out there was a lot of other gods too, but they didn't want people worshiping the other gods. They didn't care if you worshiped, if you were lawful neutral, but you were worshiping the chaotic evil god. Well, at least it's their chaotic evil god, like our god exists, but we fight that guy, so that's okay, like we might not like your followers, but at least you're following our religion still, like our set of rules, right? But what they didn't want was you worshiping gods outside the pantheon. And so the Inquisition's main job was just to hunt down all these like heretical orders. And I kind of like that too, where you had these different elements in the different religions. So I just had the leader of each of the temples and a note on them. I had the notes on all the gods, of course, and what they're the god of. And I had, a couple of notes on the Inquisition and whatnot. And if the players are interested, they'll pursue that kind of stuff, and I'll flush it out more then. I had a whole section on guilds and clubs, and a lot of these were like pretty normal type of guilds, like an engineer's guild. I had the Consortium of Tar. I had, a mining guild, and like all these type of guilds. I had some artsy guilds, like there was a guild of puppeteers from the artist quarter in Lowtown, right? And one of my favorite guilds was actually just a guild of people who ran duels for nobles, because I like the idea that the nobles, like, they're worried about the other nobles cheating, right? So there was an actual guild who provided licensed referees, and they'd have to have a second referee as well, and then each of the noble houses could have a person to oversee things as well, just make sure there's no cheating. But you'd hire this guild, and they would show up with their referees, and they would have guild sanctioned weapons, so you didn't have to worry that the other guy was using a magic sword, or maybe he poisoned his weapon or whatever. This was all run by the guild, whose reputation was based on fair, structured guilds, or duels, sorry. And if anybody cheated, that's going to make them look bad. So they were heavily invested in not doing this. And they used, they did not take the idea of their officials being bribed. That was a serious deal to them. If you got trying to bribe them, that was a blight on the entire integrity of their guild, which literally exists just so that nobles can duel each other. And the more I thought about it, the more I just really liked this guild. And so I liked a lot of these types of ideas, right? You have some weird guilds, you have some good guilds, but again, you don't have to go into a lot of detail because the players may never interact with them. Just, I have, like, all it is just one piece of paper, double-sided, and it's got all these different guilds and what they kind of do and what they're called. I don't even have the guild leaders. I can figure all that out if the players need to interact with them. I want to just have a minimalist structure as much as possible. And like I said, if the need arises, then I start to flush it out more. If I know, the player's going to be interacting with these guys, I need to come up with a bunch of dueling guidelines suddenly for my duelist guild. Like, I know there's rules, I just don't know what the rules are yet. Well, now I have a chance to figure them out. But if I don't need to, I don't need to, and that's okay too. I really like the idea of just having simple notes that I can easily find and follow on pretty much everything. So like I said, I have more detailed notes, right? Like, the players ended up doing a bunch of stuff in Lowtown. Lowtown ended up being a big deal. So did Booktown. So my notes on Booktown and Lowtown started becoming a lot more extensive over time. And, to me, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But there's no point putting in that work at the beginning and then having it just never pay off. So I want to talk a bit about a game called Vampire the Masquerade. I've mentioned this before. This particular book is called Chicago by Night, but there's a whole series of Vancouver by night, Chicago by night, Milwaukee by night, New York by night, Seattle by night, like just Paris by night, London by night, everything by night, because of course they're vampires. And they're all just like setting books for all these different cities. Now, they went into ridiculous amounts of detail, I mean, these books are like pretty thick, and it's 90% NPCs and setting information, and like 10% a couple of adventures for you to run. And again, I don't think you need to do that level of detail. Obviously, White Wolf does, because this is a published for-profit product, right? So they need there to be as much detail as possible. But one of the things I do like about it, and I've talked about this before, is their relationship maps. So they'll have a group called, they've got the Anarchs, and then they show about, like, how do they relate to all the other groups in the city? How do they relate to one another? And just having some brief general notes on this kind of stuff can make your game a lot more easy for you to run, because you're not having to remember all this. You can just look at your notes and go, okay, yeah, this guy's this guy. And if the players want to go and work somewhere and meet somebody, you're not having to, like, invent this NPC on the spot, even though a lot of it will be invented on the spot. But you have a name, and you have an organization that he's a member of. And then you also have a couple other names that he's connected to. And maybe you just have 4 or 5 people. That is absolutely fine. Like I said, to go back to that Game of Thrones example with House Lannister, you don't need to know all the Lannisters' royal cousins and stuff at the start. Now, if you need to add some later, then you come up with a name, you write that down, and you make a note that this guy's a royal cousin of the Lannisters, and he's also a Lannister, or he's not a Lannister, or whatever. But, you make a note that he's related. But you just basically need the major players. That's where you want to start. You want to have the main people and make it as simple for yourself as possible. Because these kind of games can be complicated and can be a lot of work for the Dungeon Master. But I want to try to minimize that as much as possible and streamline the process as much for my own sake and for yours as we possibly can. So I love the idea of the relationship maps, though, because one example I'm going to use from Thor comics, you have like the Enchantress, who always wanted to seduce Thor, but then you have the Executioner, who's totally in love with the Enchantress because she's so beautiful, but she just kind of sees him as this useful idiot. He's big and strong and can help protect her while she's trying to do her magic stuff and use her spells. But she doesn't care about him at all, really. She's just leading him around by the nose all the time, just leading him on. And, so that's a relationship it's obviously a very unhealthy relationship. And depending on who you look, but there's also still a relationship there. They're always together, right? But I like the idea that, at some point the Executioner realizes that she doesn't love him. She's never going to love him. She doesn't care about him at all. And then he just kind of like, decides, well, screw you, and gets himself killed and goes to Valhalla. All things considered, it's probably a good move. But I like the idea that you could have that kind of thing in your game. That, maybe the players figure out that, like, hey, dude, like, she's not into you, man. Like, she's just using you. And they try to expose this, and maybe the guy takes it well. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he gets upset about it. Or maybe he gets upset, and then a couple missions later, after the players have done some other stuff and gained a couple levels, he comes back to him and says like, hey, you know what? Like, you were right. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I just didn't want to see it. But, you know, this and this and this happened, and that helped me to see that you were right all along. And then maybe he has something he wants the players to do or whatever. And it can be an interesting way of like bringing these NPCs back into the game, because that's one of the great strengths of a city game, is that there is this cast of characters that you can keep using and reusing. And I actually think it makes the game better when they get to start knowing these people and see them over and over again. So I really like that aspect. I like the idea of having places where the players can go, right? Sometimes your players are like the guys from Cheers. They just want to go where everybody knows their name. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. How many times as a dungeon master have you made up some NPC on the spot, and then anytime the players need to interact with them, they want to go talk to that guy? Because now they feel they have a relationship with that guy. Oh, I remember like Joe the bartender, the local Bell and Weasel that gave us that job that once. Well, we're bored and we need a job. Let's go see Joe at the Bell and Weasel and get another mission, you know? So there, even though he was just some guy, you might have like randomly rolled up his name. That's why you take notes, by the way, because if you get the name wrong, they'll probably remember it. They won't remember it 99% of the time, but the time you get it wrong, they'll remember that time. So, you know, like I said, take notes. And, you know, if it's the Bell and Weasel, not the Weasel and Bell, you want to remember that too, because they'll remember that too. So, you know, just have these kind of notes, and don't be afraid to reuse the NPCs. Another thing I want to talk about, and I'll be brief on this one because I've talked about this one before, but I had my list for each player: 2 people you know and trust, 2 people you've met, 2 secrets you know, and 2 things you've seen or heard. And we had a 5-player game. So if each player has 2 people they know and trust, that's 10. Each person has 2 people they've met, that's another 10. 2 secrets they know, and 2 things they've seen or heard. So the things they've seen or heard and secrets they know, these are basically just plot hooks, right? If you look at like basic and expert set missions and even first edition missions a lot, and it still happens in a lot of missions today, but back then a big deal was players would go to a town and there'd be like random rumor table. So they'd roll on the random rumor table and each player could get like 1 rumor or whatever it was, right? And some of them were true, some of them were false, some of them were a bit of both, right? That's basically what this was. I wanted ways to introduce some different plot hooks to things going on in the city where the players, you know, on their downtime, or if they weren't sure what else to do, they could be like, hey man, I've got this thing on my character that I know this, like maybe we should look into that, you know? And then I'd be like, yes, because I kind of already have an idea for that. That's why I put it in there. Because I was like, oh, if they ever investigate this, it's going to be kind of like leading to this. And I just kind of know. That's why I put it there. And then the people they know and trust and people they've met was just a good way of me filling some NPCs into their lives, who often were just quest giver NPCs in some cases. You know, but it also gives them people they kind of care about. Like in my Shadowrun game out of Warsaw, one night the players wanted to just go to a bar and get some drinks. So they ended up finding like this kind of like rundown, dingy kind of like bar/dance club. And so they go there and they end up meeting this girl who owns the place and her friends, who I actually based off a bunch of my real life friends. All these girls that I knew from when I used to go to the bar and go dancing all the time. And I met them. And so I decided to base these people off of them. But it also gave the players, some people they met, a place they could go to when they wanted to just, you know, chill or whatever, or grab a drink. And it gave them people that they became like emotionally invested in, right? And they kind of cared about them. They were friends now. One of the guys even hooked up with one of them. And so, you know, now they had this like emotional attachment to them. And then later when one of the girls came to the players and said, hey man, like my sister's been missing for 2 days and nobody seems to know where she is. And last we saw, she left the bar with some guy, but nobody knows where he is either. And then the players immediately, of course, suspected this guy was up to no good. Turned out that he was just an innocent victim along with the girl's sister. But it gave them like this interesting mission, and there was no money for it or anything else, but it was somebody that they cared about, that they'd become friends with, whose sister was in danger. And now they had like an emotional attachment to that character. And you don't get that when your characters are just going from random town to random town. And it's just like, fetch quest here or investigation mission here. Like, they actually knew these people and hung out with them in their spare time. And now somebody close to one of them might be dead or missing or in danger. And there's just that extra level of investment. And it just makes your games that much better when the players actually care about the people in your game world. And I find that's usually a lot easier to do when it's the same cast of people, because they're set in a city or a town and everything's kind of taking place there. So I do want to talk a bit about like noble families and stuff like that. I think one thing that worked out really well in my White Spire campaign, the first act one was pretty much all just city stuff, right? So the game started, and really early on, the city is put under siege by this invading army from this empire to the south. But the empire also knows that in a straight up fight, they can't take the city. The city's too well defended, the walls are too big. But the city also knows they can't just like open the gates and come out and try to fight the army because they'll get crushed, right? They need the walls. But if anybody's ever tried to run like a siege in a Dungeons & Dragons style game, you start very quickly realizing how magic really circumvents a lot of the problems of actual medieval warfare. If you can just drop a meteor swarm on the attacking army, you don't have a story anymore. So one of the things I did, I didn't have anybody in the Mages Guild high enough to cast Meteor Swarm. But another thing I did is, because the invading army knew they couldn't take the city by force, they tried to surround the city and starve them out with one part. But they also tried to use a lot of sneaky tactics. They'd been planning this for a long time. They'd managed to infiltrate some people into the legal system. And one of the things that was going on in my game is the king was like 84 years old and was senile. And the line of succession was pretty unclear because he'd been married like 3 times. And he'd named his daughter from the 3rd marriage as his heir. But, you know, she was like 18, and then she's got all these older half-brothers and sisters, some of whom were in their 50s, who were all probably more capable of running the kingdom than her, some of whom wanted to run the kingdom. But I liked the idea that since the king was still on the throne, but incapable of making decisions, it really meant the city was in kind of a leaderless position, right? There's nobody really who's able to step up and take charge. So you have a lot of under officials trying to run everything. So then the invading army from the empire, they've managed to bribe some of those officials. They've actually, the players never found this one out, but they murdered one of the officials and replaced him with a doppelganger. In fact, their plan was to murder the king and replace him with a doppelganger, which eventually does end up happening, but the players found out in time and managed to expose it. But they had a lot of these kind of things going on. They introduced, and I stole this idea from an old Pathfinder campaign path, or mission path, adventure path, whatever they called it. I never played Pathfinder, so I just read about it and it sounded interesting, but like I said, I never played it, so I didn't know too much about it, which is probably good, because then I could steal their idea but do it my own way. And they had like this magical disease, because diseases were a big deal in the Middle Ages. But in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, it's kind of like a siege, where magic just kind of makes disease not an issue. If you have high-level clerics and paladins that can just cure disease and are essentially immune to it, then it's just not a big deal. But I like the idea of a magical disease, which was, what I took from their idea. So the army, or the Empire guys, had introduced this magical plague into the docks, and now all the higher-level clerics and paladins are in the dock district trying to keep this thing from becoming a full-blown epidemic. But meanwhile, they start figuring out, this is not a natural disease. This is magical in its origin. So the players, having already proven themselves a bit and now getting to 3rd or 4th level and starting to get a bit of recognition, these people are like, hey, we're all busy trying to stop this thing from killing everybody in the city, but we need to know who's causing it and how, and we need you to figure this out for us. So that gave the players a really good investigation mission, ended up leading to a big climatic fight towards the end too, which was great. And, once that had been dealt with, then the city was able to contain the disease and everything was fine. And I think it's important, I want to make a quick note here. I was prepared, I wanted the players to succeed and stop the disease, right? Because I want them to succeed, ultimately. But I'm also prepared that if they screw things up royally, then this plague's going to wipe out half the city. Because I want there to always be stakes in my game. That's where a lot of the fun comes from, is this tension and conflict. And if you try to make the players fail, they're going to get frustrated and they're not going to enjoy it. But if you never let them fail, and they know that no matter what we do, we're probably going to succeed, then it really takes a lot of the tension out of the game. So you need to have that idea in your head that if the players don't think of a way to deal with this, or if they're not able to respond properly, things are going to get bad. And maybe it doesn't mean the end of your game session, right? It wasn't going to be the end of mine, but it did mean that the city was going to be ravaged by this disease. And now maybe the army can attack directly, because if everybody's sick and can't defend themselves, suddenly the city's looking a lot more vulnerable. So one of the other things they did, though, as I mentioned magic, is because I knew that the Wizards Guild was going to be an issue. And I wanted to kind of neutralize them. Because another thing is, I didn't want a bunch of high-level NPC wizards to solve the situation. I want the player characters to do that. So one of the things I had the Empire guys do is when they've infiltrated some of these officials and stuff, they end up passing a bunch of really steep taxes specifically on the Wizards Guild, like just deliberately targeting the Wizard Guild. And then I had this great speech by one of the NPC wizards who got all upset about how, don't they know how much they need us? We're one of the main linchpins of the city, and then they're just going to do this. They've got an army outside the gate. And then he, ends up with this big they don't think they need us. They think they can just tax us and exploit us. Well, screw them. They can deal with this army. We're not lifting a finger to help them. They can come and beg us for help when they need it. When the army is in the city walls and they come and they apologize and they remove the taxes and they personally apologize for everything, then we'll help them. And the one player character wizard was just yeah, he was totally on board with that idea. So it worked out really well because it neutralized the wizards, but it also gave the players this chance where if we figure out what's going on, which they did, and they were able to expose some of the corruption, the bribes, and everything else, then the wizards are suddenly oh, hey, we've been played here. And now, all of a sudden, they're more on board, right? And this was one of the ways that the players could help save the city. There was also an invading army that was trying to come underneath the city through the Hollow Hills section and try to take the city from within. And the players were able to stop that. So that was another one of the big events that was happening in the city. But I had a bunch of city-specific things, these kind of politics, the outbreak of the disease, and a lot of these city elements that really grounded the players in the idea that we're stuck inside a city during a siege with a massive army outside the gates, and this is what we have to deal with now. But it also gave me an excuse to move them around the different districts, because the city was kind of put on lockdown for a while too, right? But the characters, because they were officially sanctioned to do these missions, they were hey, here's a pass to show the guards that says that you're allowed to go to the docks. Here's a pass that shows that you're allowed to go to here, or here's a pass saying that you've got 1 week to just go wherever you need to go to deal with whatever you're dealing with. We trust you at this point. Just do whatever you have to do to get things under control. And it helped the players to feel pretty good too. They kind of earned some prestige. And I think that's one of the great rewards of a city campaign as well. My players ended up saving the city. The king's been murdered and was replaced by a doppelganger. The players expose this, and the doppelganger gets captured and thrown in prison. The princess ends up becoming the queen, and she ends up choosing one of her older stepbrothers to be her advisor, and puts another one on some board as well. So they're kind of appeased a little bit. There's a few that weren't too happy that the youngest of the bunch ends up getting the throne, but the players ended up having to work a lot of that out, and they were officially recognized as the heroes of Whitespire, and they were given official title and stuff, and they were given some money, although the treasury was pretty poor at this point after the siege, so they didn't get as much as the players were probably hoping for, but they still got some money and whatnot, and they got a recognition and they got a title, which they were able to exploit to their own advantage later on, when people would be you give them a hard time, and they're with some of the guards or whatever, and they're don't you know who I am? I'm one of the heroes of Whitespire. Look at me. And they're oh crap, sorry sir, I no offense, please do not tell the queen, And so it was kind of good because it gave them some rewards that they were able to deal with in a different way. It wasn't just treasure or money, right? It was this recognition and status. So I think that was really good. I like the idea of competing factions everywhere, right? Like I said, if you have a thieves guild, I want there to be a different thieves guild, that they're maybe in conflict with. And the reason is because if the players might want to join one of the factions, well, I want there to be some sort of conflict there. I don't want there to be one thieves guild that just runs the entire city, because then there's no real conflict. I mean, maybe you have conflicts within the thieves guild, but you can do both, have conflict within and without. And these conflicts make the story a lot more interesting, and they give the players more opportunities. Like, if it's a sandbox, like, people have referred to games as either sandbox or railroad. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term. The railroad is the game where the dungeon master plots out everything and it just goes down the tracks and it can't deviate because it's on rails, right? And it just has your set story and everything happens the way your story was designed. The sandbox is just a box where the players can do anything and everything they want. My games tend to be a bit of both. I have some sandbox elements, I have some railroad elements. I look at it like this. It's a giant sandbox, but there's a bunch of specific toys that are in that sandbox that the players can play with and that are, probably going to get moved into their path at some point or another. Because I like to have, some sort of structure or some sort of ideas, but I also want the players to be able to decide how they're going to solve these things and what they want to do. And that's why, I said I have a ton of different plot hooks, and a lot of them never got explored. But that's okay, because, this plot hook is literally like one paragraph. So, it didn't take me that much time. If they never explored it, there's one paragraph worth of stuff, and that's fine. But, I don't want to have 10 pages on that, and then they don't explore it, because it kind of sucks, and it's a giant waste of my time. So, I said I was going to talk a bit about, like, Dragon Heist, but this doesn't have to be Dragon Heist. It's not specific to this adventure. It's not specific to Waterdeep. This could be any game with a pre-existing campaign world, right? Like, whether it's Waterdeep or Neverwinter, whether it's the world of Greyhawk, whatever, maybe it's Skarn or whatever, right? Whatever campaign world you're in, there's big cities, and a lot of those cities are already established, which can save you a lot of work. Don't be afraid to use somebody else's stuff. Like I said, I really wanted to build my own city with Whitespire, but a lot of the ideas I took from a combination of the Blight. I took some stuff from Monty Cook's excellent city source, Tallus. That's actually where he tested the 3rd edition rules when he was building the game. He designed a city and a campaign, and they used those to rule test everything. I mentioned the Vornheim Complete City Kit. It doesn't really have any adventures, but it does have some really good random tables. Vornheim's like a little weird. It was a lot more just strange than I was looking for from my game world, but somebody might like that. In which case, I would highly recommend it either way. It's quite excellent, but don't be afraid to kind of tailor things to what you want. Even if it's something like Waterdeep, it doesn't have to be this Waterdeep. It should be your Waterdeep. And if you want to change some stuff around or add different things, go for it. It's your game world. Don't feel that you're locked into whatever somebody published in an adventure. But I did want to mention Dragon Heist because I think something like this is a great starting set for a city campaign. It is a lot more sandbox-ish than a lot of other pre-published campaigns. I'm not saying that it's entirely, because there's still a set story, and a lot of what happens might depend on, like in this one, it'll depend on what season and stuff like that, right? And you'll have different factions that you might be trying to oppose, right? Which is a nice touch. You could have different villains depending on what. So I think that's all really good. But the thing I really like about it most is it gives the players a chance to get established in the city, to build some roots there. The players can get their own inn, and now they run this inn, and they have a permanent base of operations and a place that they're emotionally invested in succeeding, right? Like, I remember as a player when we played Dragon Heist, we started getting pretty upset when anything threatened the livelihood of our business, and when business started getting slow, we started getting a little worried about that. And that was just a fun element of the game that you don't have when you're just wandering from town to town or being some mercenary just, plummeting through dungeons or plundering vaults for treasure or whatever else, So I think that there's a lot of neat aspects to that. And, a lot of the best campaigns are those type of things. And like I said, this doesn't mean that you still can't run dungeons, because you can do both. I love the idea of, players getting sent or hired to go do different missions or whatever. Maybe some necromancer starts animating all the dead in the crypts or something, and the temple can't figure out what's going on, so they hire the players to go deal with it, like I said. I mean, those kind of elements can be really good. They can have investigation type stuff combined with a lot of combat and fighting undead, which is always great. And, fighting evil necromancers, which is also great. Also great. They're not ungreat. Also great. And I think that a city just has so much to offer. But like I said at the beginning of the video, it is a lot more work, and I don't want to downplay that, because as a dungeon master, it's going to take a lot more commitment out of you to run something like this than it will to just be able to run a bunch of dungeons. And that can be very intimidating, especially if you're a dungeon master, But that's why I like the idea of something like Dragon Heist. You could run somebody else's material that's already been play tested and pre-published, and there's a story there with NPCs and everything else ready for you. And then after your players have gotten a level 4 or 5, and you've had a chance to dip your toe into the setting and see how you like it, and then you can build your own game from there. And sure, you could just go run Dungeon of the Mad Mage after that, but you could do your own thing and just build from there. And I just like that idea so much more. So I'm starting to ramble. Those are my thoughts on city games. I actually did another version of this video, but I didn't like it. So I'm having a hard time remembering what I said in the first video that I might not have said here, that I wanted to make sure I got in both. But it's okay. Hopefully the video was pretty coherent still. But I really like this style of game, and I like the fact that you can still go to other planes. Like in my Shadowrun game, we ended up having what we called the World Tour, and it was one of my favorite parts of the campaign, where they ended up going to all these different countries and stuff. And a lot of it was missions from their backgrounds, right? So the players would be like, "Oh yeah, I used to be this, or I used to do that, or whatever, and now I'm a Shadowrunner." But then they get a call from one of their buddies, and he's just like, "Hey man, I'm kind of in trouble, and I need some help." And you're the only guy I can really trust to do this. And the player's on it. And it's some NPC they've never met. It's just somebody's like, "Oh yeah, I used to be a cop in Los Angeles, and I had this partner." And all of a sudden the partner needs them, or all of a sudden somebody needs them, or, "Hey, my brother does this," and now all of a sudden their brother calls them, right? And it was an excuse to get them out of the city and move them around a lot, but to still let them know that there's this place where they can call home, and when whatever they're dealing with right now, once it's been dealt with and it's all put aside, you can go back there and you've still got your home. And the fact that there's NPCs there that they can become a lot more emotionally invested with, I think is a great thing. The fact that you can kind of threaten those people or whatever, and that the players will get emotionally involved, is a really good thing, I think. I just like these things where it's a good way to raise the stakes in your game. And you don't, you can still get that in a dungeon crawl, but the stakes come from the combat and how tight of a fight this is, right? But some of the best experiences I'm sure if we were to ask my players from the White Spire game, several of whom said that was the best campaign they've ever been in for any game. But if you talk to them about what their favorite moments were, sure, some of them are going to be their fight with Bellatrix, Widow of Lust, because that fight was they were 17th or 18th level. They had 9th level spells, and that fight was razor thin. They were that close to losing it all. And this was against one of the big NPCs who'd been behind a lot of stuff. And so it was a great combat. But for every one great combat that they'll be, still remembering, they're gonna also remember just hanging out with Vance and all his buddies and spinning the demon wheel and playing all these crazy drinking games. And those were some of their funnest moments of the campaign. A lot of it was nothing to do with an actual combat. It was just role playing and doing different things, and the relationships that they built up with a lot of these people, and those were the fun experiences. And I think that Dungeons and Dragons is a game that sometimes gets a bad reputation as being a great starter game, but it's not, but not really a deep game. It's just you're just killing orcs and goblins and stuff like that. And like I said at the beginning of this video, it can be that, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to look down on dungeon crawls, like I said earlier. because I think dungeon crawls are awesome too. I'll probably even do a video on running great dungeon crawls at some point. But Dungeons and Dragons is whatever you and your players want it to be. And I think that's the thing I really want to stress here, is that your game can be just as politically deep as any other game out there if you just want it to be. It can have, as much like great, like it can be a romance game. It can be an adventure game. It can be high magic. It can be gritty, dark, low magic. It could be like a Conan style campaign. It can be almost whatever you want. And if you and your players are involved and are invested in it, and everybody's just showing up and having a great time and they love their characters, it doesn't matter as long as it is what you want it to be. That's what I'm trying to say here. So I do think that there's definitely a spot in D&D for all these other types of games. It doesn't have to be just dungeon crawls, and it doesn't have to be just city games. It can be, it can be an exploration game where you go to other planes of existence, even at fairly low levels. And it can be a mystery game. It can be a murder mystery. It can be whatever it is that you want. And to me, city games have a great way of combining all those different elements, where it can be everything all at the same time, all in one game. So, anyways, those are my thoughts. Feel free to subscribe, like, hit the comments, or hit the bell for notification. And most importantly, leave me your comments in the comment section. I promise to read every comment. I don't necessarily respond to every comment, but I promise you I read every single one. And usually I respond as well. It might take me a week or so to get to it, depending, but I love hearing your stories about this kind of stuff. I'd love to hear about city games you ran, or city games that you were a member of, where your dungeon master just did a great game or whatever. Or maybe you had a game and it was just really bad, and now you're like, we did this once and it didn't work out, but maybe you've given me some new ideas and I think we might try it again or something like that. I love hearing that kind of stuff. And the truth is, I'm not an expert at anything either. The reason why I feel comfortable doing a lot of these videos is because I've played Dungeons and Dragons since I was like 12 or 13 years old, and I'm 50. So I've made a lot of mistakes along the line, but I've learned from them, and I've taken things that I did well and things that other people have done well. And over the years, you just start getting to this point where you start realizing what's working and what's not, and how to kind of put it all together. But you don't get to that point without making a lot of mistakes along the way. I think that we have this idea sometimes like, oh man, your game sounds so good, or it sounds like there's all this political stuff and there's all this other stuff. And it's like, yeah, but you weren't there 30 years ago when I was trying to run those kind of games, and they were kind of garbage. But you're just hearing the highlights of them now after all these years of experience doing them. But don't be afraid to make those mistakes, because at the other end, you're going to start finding some games where you're just like, man, that was just incredible. And you're going to have something where you can look back on it, and it's going to be a lot more memorable than just killing orcs in a dungeon. I promise you that. So, thanks for everything, and I'll see you next time in the city, not the dungeon.